I'm welcoming back to the program today Corey Dolgon, who's professor of sociology at Stonehill College, also author of the book Kill It to Save It, recently available in paperback. Corey, last time you were on, we talked a lot about, many different things, including the idea of the privatization of different areas of government under the pretense of saving some of those institutions. And recently we've had this sort of come up again when thinking about the VA and the fired VA secretary saying that part of the reason that he was pushed out was his lack of desire to go in the privatization direction, which the Trump administration seemed to want. We've seen Trump be critical of the United States Postal Service, another favorite of the right to talk about privatization. What do you think is really the catalyst for this desire to privatize? Is it the possibility of privatizing in a way that does crony capitalist handouts, or is it sort of the moral idea of private is better than public?
Yeah, well, that's a great question and a great way to frame it because I would argue, as I do in the book, that it's both. And what the book really tries to explain is how the what I consider kill it to save it mentality and framework for American policymaking today is, in fact, crony capitalism with the kind of added ideological and cultural component that it tries to convince people that it's actually better for them. And so, on the one hand, the privatization of the public sector is this attempt to just wrench out whatever profit is still possible from the public sector, privatizing everything that works and everything that doesn't work for the sake of handouts to corporate capital, but at the same time justifying them through this kind of morality play about hard work, who's deserving. The corporate sector knows better than the public sector how to run things. And that ideology is still strong despite decades and decades of failure on the part of the private sector to run public institutions.
Yeah, it's amazing how successful the talking point has been of government is inefficient and I'd rather things be handled by the private sector, as if it's almost like a dogmatic religious type belief when the truth is
Absolutely.
usually more nuanced, right? Like, for example, my economic views are most closely aligned with like the well-regulated social democracies of Scandinavia, which recognize that, hey,
Right.
capitalism for many areas does create incentives for creativity and research and development and innovation, but not in all areas do we want that market system. Healthcare, for example, being one of them, education being one of them. The simple idea that private is always better than public, that government is always inefficient, even by some on the left has been accepted to some degree. And I find that very
That's
worrying.
right. No, I agree. And, I think that in the past, you and I probably could have had an interesting conversation where we might actually disagree on whether or not the public sector could inspire that level of creativity and whether or not capitalism was necessary at all. But that kind of conversation between people on the left and the further left has been so drowned out by the rightward movement of our politics that it was, and I blame Clinton as much as Reagan for this, that the idea of triangulation strategies on the part of the Democrats was such that they bought into that ideology that the private sector actually could run things better and that the public sector needed to be downsized. And instead of improving and trying to create a bureaucracy that worked, the mantra became kill the bureaucracy. And so by killing the bureaucracy, it became a kind of ruse for the right under which privatization became the narrative. And as you suggest, it's become the narrative to such a degree that even most Democrats can't run on trying to recreate a public sector. As the book suggests, we were actually moving in the direction of many of the social welfare democracies, the welfare state of Western Europe, up until the 1960s and 1970s. And it was really the post-Vietnam era and eventually Reagan that saw us take this great U-turn away from a public sector and a welfare state and towards what we have now, which is just in some ways the worst kind of banditry capitalism.
Yeah, and we've even seen how it has tricked or bamboozled or convinced a lot of right-wing voters, as we've been talking about. I mean, at minimum, dating back to the 2010 successes of the Tea Party, but certainly well beyond, into supporting candidates who are straight up running on policies that wouldn't be good for those voters. And tax plans are an example. And you say, well, hold on a second, this tax plan wouldn't benefit you, it would benefit the very rich. And there's sort of this idea that, well, I might be in that group someday, as statistically unlikely as it is. I think it's similar with some of these public institutions, right? Which is, listen, you'd
Absolutely.
benefit now from more public health funding, from whatever the case may be. And it's sort of the same reaction, like, yeah, well, that may be in the short term, but the truth is that the private sector is just more efficient and I'd rather them run it. It's an amazing bamboozling of voters that's happened.
I think that's true to an extent. And the one thing I would add as a caveat is that I think we've seen in part with Donald Trump's election, although I think it's really hard to take out the hardcore kind of white supremacy that really shaped a lot of his voting base. But regardless, I think we also have to look at the ways in which it may not simply be a bamboozling of an electorate that just was too easily swayed by falsehoods and by lies and fake news, but it's also that they've tapped into this morality, as you suggest. And I argue in the book that that morality goes back to our very beginnings as a nation. That this mythology about hyper individualism, about rugged, burly guys, if only let free from public regulations and responsibilities, will succeed, and that that's what's always driven our country to its great success, is just mythology. But it's still deeply ingrained in our core values and identity. So while I do agree that there's a certain bamboozling going on, a lot of the bamboozling is so hardwired into our mythology and our identity that it's very easily tapped by these right-wing spin doctors.
And I think maybe that's why the populist rhetoric that we heard from both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump
That's right.
worked in a sense, even though there's, of course, a very big difference between left wing and right wing populism. And there's a night and day difference in terms of what the legislative actions would have been by someone like Bernie Sanders and the more authoritarian actions that we've seen under Donald Trump. But I think that if we go back and saw and sort of considered how powerful the populist sounding rhetoric was to both voters that called themselves left and right, I think that's kind of a big indication of the predisposition from people to be attracted
That's
to
right.
those ideas, given what we've seen in terms of neoliberalism and corporatism for the last 50 or more years, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. And as I say in the book, populism cuts both ways. And for me, the weakness and the weakness of vision as well as will of the Democrats really played through in this election. And so, this was a moment where the kind of left populism that Sanders represented was right, and I think right for winning an election. And the idea that Clinton was the selection in part because of a lot of really bad, institutionalized party politics and power from the Democratic Party, but also the notion that Sanders wasn't electable, which leads us to the question of could he have been any less electable than Clinton? But the Democratic Party was beholden to its own set of neoliberalism, and I think was scared by the kind of left-wing populism that Sanders represented. We'll see whether the Democrats in 2020, 2018, and then 2020 can welcome a much more radical left vision, the kind of public welfare, social welfare politics that you were discussing earlier, or they're going to remain these kinds of so-called centrist Democrats who are afraid of real change.
Are you so I think there's certainly more than two views on this, but two views about how Democrats should run in 2018 and in 2020 would be, on the one hand, those who say you need to just run as far to the left as possible, as far to the left as the Democratic Party will sort of allow candidates to run and allow them to win primaries. and that on balance, you're going to do better that way. There's another approach, which I find to be a little more pragmatic, and I think it's maybe a little more thoughtful, which is you need to calculate what type of candidate will do best depending on where they're running. So if you're running against a corporate Democrat in West Virginia versus against a Republican in Texas versus, who knows, someone in Vermont, that there's sort of different types of candidates and approaches that make sense. Do you subscribe more to one or the other view, or some third view I haven't mentioned?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of third views. Um, I would suggest that there's a truth to both, but ultimately, especially in congressional elections and statewide elections, I'm a grassroots organizer at heart, and a Democrat with a small d, and a socialist, I guess, with a big S. But I would suggest that you know the people will have to decide this. And too often we leave it to party strategists and party functionaries. And one of the things that came out of the last failed election in 2016 were all of these memos from places in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, from union workers and other kind of local leaders who were saying, the Democrats never took on the class argument, and they never took on the opportunity to talk about a multicultural working class, as opposed to a much more focused identity politics that seemed more for marketing purposes than they did for social change purposes. I really think the grassroots decide this in ways that are really important. And so, I would suggest that the grassroots really is further to the left among the Democrats. They tend to isolate them after elections. They love them when they're doing the organizing work. And they're the ones that eventually have to determine what the ideology of the party is going to be. I think it's a much further left ideology than the Democrats, who hold the power of the party, are probably willing to accept. So I think we'll see the Democrats do better. I think we'll see the Democrats be very schizophrenic in many ways. And so you'll see the kinds of conservative Democrats like Moore, Jones
Jones, yeah.
in Alabama, and some of the recent congressional elections, special elections. But I also think we'll see some really great left candidates winning as well. And I think there's going to be a little bit of a, not quite a civil war, but certainly a real power struggle in the party come 2020.
The book now available in paperback is Kill It to Save It. We've been speaking with the book's author and professor of sociology at Stonehill College, Cory Dolgon. Cory, great to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you, David. Thank you so much.